Hi, my name is Val Westover, and welcome to Aperture, controlling light and depth of field. More people get confused by aperture than shutter speed. Let's take out all of the confusion right now about aperture. Aperture is not in your camera, it's in your lens. There is a diaphragm inside of the lens that can get large or small. They call this diaphragm the aperture. The aperture is an adjustable circular opening that controls the amount of light coming through the lens. When your lens has a large aperture, a lot of light can pass through it. When you use a small aperture, a little bit of light can pass through it. The main function of aperture is to gather light and to control the amount of light coming through the lens. Lenses gather light. Apertures can restrict the volume of light that they gather, which gives you control of the amount of light that reaches your image sensor. If you don't know how to control your aperture, just do what your eyes are doing. When you go into bright light, your pupils get small. When you go into low light, your pupils get large. Your iris changes the size of your pupil, just like the aperture changes the size of the diaphragm. The f-stop refers to the size of the aperture. When we refer to the size of an aperture, we are not referring to the f number. We are just referring to the physical size of the aperture. The f number is just a measurement of the size of the aperture. The smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. The larger the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture. F-stops are in fact the low denominator part of fractions. This is why smaller numbers represent larger openings. It is a lack of engraving space on lenses that cause this problem of perception. Typically, the larger the aperture, the more expensive the lens. They call this a fast lens. They call this a fast lens because more light can pass through it, allowing you to use faster shutter speeds. Most people have some sort of zoom lens that came with their camera. They most likely have a f3.5 to f5.6 lens. When they are not zoomed in, this is an f3.5 lens. This is great because there's going to be times when they need a large aperture of f3.5. However, it's important to know that as soon as they zoom in, their lens is now an f5.6 lens, meaning that their aperture can only open up as large as f5.6. We can't measure distance by saying from here to there. We measure distance with inches, feet, and miles. We can't measure light by saying I need more or less light. There's a very easy way to measure light in photography. A stop of light. One full stop of light. What you're looking at below is a ruler. What one full f-stop of light is next to another full f-stop of light. For example, f4 is one full stop of light larger than f5.6. When you change your aperture by just one full stop of light larger, from f5.6 to f4, you have just doubled the amount of light coming through your lens. When you go in the opposite direction, you are now taking in half as much light. So anytime that you change your f-stop by one full stop, you will half or double the amount of light that comes through the lens, depending on whether you make the aperture smaller or larger. Aperture controls light and depth of field. We just spent some time discussing how aperture controls light. Let's now discuss how aperture controls depth of field. When you focus, there's an area in front of your subject and behind your subject that will be in focus. They call this an acceptable area of focus. They call this area the depth of field. You can control this area that will be in focus. When you use a large aperture, you can have a shallow depth of field. When you use a small aperture, you can have a longer depth of field. Depth of field can be increased or decreased depending on the size of the aperture. When light passes through a lens, it crisscrosses at the point of focus. This area where the light crisscrosses is your depth of field. The thin vertical red lines represent your subject. The yellow box represents the depth of field, the area in front and behind your subject that will be in focus. When you use a large aperture, the light passes through a wider area, so the depth of field is shallow. When you use a small aperture, the light passes through a smaller area, so the depth of field becomes longer. Use a large aperture if you want shallow depth of field. This image was taken with a large aperture of f4. By using a large aperture, the hands are in focus and the background is blurry, a shallow depth of field. Now, to accomplish a shot like this, where you are blurring the background, let me first explain about distance to subject. I'll explain by taking a picture of my finger with my eye. Let's pretend that the aperture in my eye right now is f4. Now I'm going to hold my finger very close to my eye. My finger is in focus, but the background is very blurry, out of focus. Now as I start to move my finger farther and farther away from my eye, the aperture in my eye is still f4, but the background is becoming more and more in focus. Eventually, if my arm was long enough, the background would be just as in focus as my finger. So if you want to blur the background with a shallow depth of field, use a large aperture, zoom in, and get in close. Distance to subject also affects depth of field. Both images were taken with a large aperture of f4. The photographer who took this shot needed a large aperture of f4 because it was such low light. She did not want a shallow depth of field, so she did not zoom in all the way, and she backed up to distance herself, giving her longer depth of field. This image of the moose was taken with an aperture of f4. By using a large aperture, getting in close to the moose and focusing on his eyes, I was able to blur the background, causing a 3D effect. Oh, by the way, please don't get too close to a moose. I used a long lens and I hid behind the safety of several trees. This image on Half Dome in Yosemite was taken with an aperture of f16. By using a small aperture, distancing myself from my subjects, I was able to have a much longer depth of field, making the subjects and the background in focus. By the way, please don't get too close to the edge of a cliff on a windy day. Here's a chart that will help understand what happens to depth of field when you change the aperture. The purpose of this chart is to show that as you make your aperture smaller, you get longer depth of field. As you make your aperture larger, you get shallow depth of field. The image that was shot with a larger aperture on top has a much more shallow depth of field than the image that was shot with a smaller aperture on the bottom. We now know that aperture gathers light and controls the amount of light coming through the lens. You can open it up to allow more light in, or close it down to reduce the amount of light that comes in. Aperture tips. Number 1. A small f number indicates a large aperture. Number 2. A large aperture allows more light. Number 3. A large f number indicates a small aperture. Number 4. A small aperture allows less light. Number 5. Use a large aperture in low light situations. Number 6. Use a small aperture when you have too much light. Number 7. Use a large aperture when you want a shallow depth of field. Number 8. Use a small aperture when you want to increase the depth of field. Aperture practice. We are now going to do a review. However, we are not done discussing aperture. Aperture practice material number 1. Aperture controls light and depth of field. Number 2. Use a large aperture to make the background in a picture out of focus. Number 3. Aperture works very much the same as the human eye. Number 4. Would you use a smaller or larger aperture in these conditions? Bright light, small. Nighttime, large. Portrait photography, large. Landscape photography, small. Number 5. A higher number indicates a smaller aperture. Number 6. A small aperture allows less light. Number 7. Use a small aperture to make your subject and background in focus. Number 8. Each full f-stop lets in half as much light as the full setting before it and double the light of the full setting after it. Nine. Find an object and practice photographing it using all of your f-stops and compare each image to see your results. To keep your photography very easy while having more control of your exposure, here are 3 things to keep in mind about aperture. Number 1. Use a large aperture when you need more light or when you're trying to achieve a shallow depth of field. Number 2. Use a small aperture to restrict light or when you are trying to achieve a long depth of field. And number 3, ISO determines the sensitivity of the image sensor, whereas aperture determines how much light strikes the image sensor. Here's how I suggest that you practice. If you want to isolate aperture, you can accomplish this in Aperture Priority, A or AV mode. This is a very easy mode to shoot in. In Aperture Priority, your camera will be in charge of your shutter speed, giving you the ability to be in charge of your ISO and your aperture. How to practice with aperture. First, select Aperture Priority, A or AV mode. Now, go outside where it's bright and select a low ISO number, such as 100 or 200. Next, we're going to want to blur the background with a shallow depth of field. We are going to select an aperture of f5.6. Because to blur the background, you need to zoom in, and most people will not be able to have a larger aperture than f5.6 once they zoom in. That's okay, because by zooming in and getting in very close to your subject with a large aperture of f5.6, you will be able to have incredible blurry backgrounds. Remember to keep an eye on your shutter speed. If your shutter speed is too slow, raise your ISO. If you get in too close to your subject, your camera most likely won't be able to focus. If this is the case, just back up a little bit until you notice that your camera can lock in on the focus. Now let's switch it up. Let's have longer depth of field. This will be easy. Just use a smaller aperture of f16, go a little bit wider, and now everything will be in focus with a much longer depth of field. By selecting a much smaller aperture of f16, you will be restricting the light greatly from striking your camera's image sensor. So just remember, while shooting in Aperture Priority, even though your camera is in charge of shutter speed for you, you must always keep an eye on your shutter speed before you take your shot. If you notice that your camera has selected a shutter speed that is too slow, raise your ISO. If your shutter is slower than 1/60th of a second, then raise your ISO until you have a fast enough shutter speed. By raising your ISO higher and higher, your image sensor will become more and more sensitive to light, forcing your camera's shutter to go faster and faster, making sure that the image sensor doesn't get too much light. Once your shutter speed is fast enough, then you can start shooting again. For sharp, non-blurry pictures, make sure that your camera is using a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or faster when you're hand holding your camera. And if your shutter speed is too slow, raise your ISO. By understanding and controlling aperture, you will have more control of light and the special effects of depth of field. Now go and spend as much time as you need shooting in Aperture Priority until you feel that you have a strong understanding about what is happening when you use smaller or larger apertures. Remember, all you have to do in Aperture Priority is select your desired aperture. Then, keep an eye on the shutter speed. And if your shutter speed is too slow, raise your ISO. Aperture bonus. Do you sometimes wonder which lens to use and why? This is a common concern, and this example should help you to decide on which lens to use depending on how you're trying to compose your image based on your distance from your subject. The smaller the millimeter number on your lens, the wider the angle. As you use larger millimeter numbers, the more you start to zoom into your scene. Use the lens based on how you want to compose your image. So as an artist and a photographer, you decide. Do you want a wide-angle shot of your entire scene? Or do you want to zoom in closer to showcase something or someone specific within your scene? Congratulations! You have just completed Aperture, controlling light and depth of field. You're now ready to move on to the next step, shutter speed, controlling light and movement.